The confrontation between Palestinians and Israelis provides the setting for one of the world's longest-lasting crises. Despite countless rounds of peace negotiations, a solution to the crisis appears as remote as ever. In a July 2005 advisory opinion, the International Court of Justice declared that Israel's construction of a security wall on Palestinian land and its continuing occupation of portions of the West Bank violated international law. Israel and many of its supporters have dismissed the decision with contempt. Some have gone so far as to accuse the court of having been motivated by anti-Semitism. Since that decision was brought down, Israel has announced plans to define its borders with Palestine unilaterally by annexing Palestinian land in the West Bank and portions of Jerusalem. Far from putting an end to this decade-old crisis, such a step would be in flagrant violation of international law. Furthermore, it is guaranteed to generate further confrontation and upheaval. As an issue that is vitally linked to the crisis in Iraq and the rest of the Middle East, it is essential for all of us that a resolution to this dispute be a negotiated one that addresses the concerns of all of the parties so that all are prepared to live with it.
I'm going to try to tell you a little bit of, probably most of you already know what military occupation actually means for the Palestinians who live in it. We've heard of occupation, but the majority of the time we actually hear it from the perspectives of the occupiers. And it, of course, is a completely different experience for the people who are experiencing complete eradication of their rights. There is a structure of Israeli occupation that is basically meant to strip Palestinians of their civil rights, of their ability to develop, of their economic rights. It's practically impossible to have an economically viable business state because of all the checkpoints. So Israel actually does this through several ways. One is settlements, another is checkpoints and roadblocks, another is the permit system, another is the wall, another is the dual legal system, one for the Israeli settlers and one for the Palestinians living in the occupied territories. In the West Bank alone, there are over 190 Israeli settlements. They're built on confiscated Palestinian land, and Palestinians whose land they're built on cannot move into them. But many times the settlements actually take the agricultural land of the Palestinian villages. For example, my village. Much of the it was an agricultural village, but now you hardly see any young men of working age who live there because they simply cannot survive economically, and they try to provide for their families by leaving. So a lot of times if you look in the streets, it's just very young people or very old people or women mothers. But what happens with the settlements is that they're built on Palestinian land, and then the Palestinian villages and towns and cities are no longer able to expand and develop because the settlements not only have their own built-up area, but they reserve huge spaces of land, of Palestinian land, so that they themselves can develop. So I remember when I was there as a teenager, one of the things that most disturbed me about the settlements, besides seeing them and settlers in the streets all the time with guns, is that many times our water in the village would be shut off, and the settlement right above us called Shiloh had, just their water was never shut off. They had plenty of water to water things, for swimming pools, all of that kind of stuff. And our electricity would also be off and turned off. Theirs would not be turned off. And the road system is, of course, another way to control the population and constantly exert your power and let Palestinians know who's in control. In the West Bank alone, there are ranging from, at any given time, 500 to figures I've seen most often, 757 roadblocks and checkpoints throughout the West Bank. And I know that because of the media portrayal of this conflict, a lot of people assume that the checkpoints and roadblocks are often located on the border with Israel. But in fact, the vast majority of these roadblocks and checkpoints are located in between Palestinian towns and villages, separating Palestinians from each other, from their schools, from their neighbors, from their families. The thing is, the roadblocks and checkpoints actually serve to ghettoize the Palestinian territories, to ghettoize the West Bank. Gaza itself is completely surrounded. People cannot, it's been a sealed open-air prison for so long now, with just terrible consequences for the population there, huge poverty levels, major unemployment, just creating simmering pot, just waiting for something to happen. But in the West Bank, there are hundreds of these, like I said, and they serve to ghettoize and isolate Palestinians from each other. Then there's the wall, the Israeli wall, which a lot of people, again, because our media doesn't tend to do its own investigative work, tend to believe that it actually does separate Palestinians and Israelis like the Israeli government claims. But in fact, the wall does not separate Palestinians from Israelis. It separates Palestinians from Palestinians. It separates Palestinians from their homes, from their agricultural land, from their neighbors, from their schools, from their hospitals. 80% of the wall is actually projected to be built deep inside the West Bank, not on the border. And in fact, it's meant that, the figures I forget, it's either 65 to 75% of Palestinian communities that live in proximity to the wall are now poor. They now live under the poverty level. And in one village in the north of the West Bank, which was traditionally an agricultural village, Israel basically took the agricultural land and the water resources, which the northern West Bank is pretty famous for, and it placed them on the Israeli side of the wall. So now the farmers on the north can actually access their fields, to work their fields, without this extremely difficult to obtain permit. So at any given time, these farmers in Jayus, 65% of them cannot get a permit to access their land. And when you're constantly trying to obtain a permit to farm your land, one day here, 1 week there, it makes it just unviable. And so actually these farmers, the majority of them in Jayus depended on their olive groves for subsistence. They were very self-sufficient with their agriculture. And now the majority of people in Jayus are dependent on external food aid. And I think what Israel is actually trying to do is get the Palestinians to leave, because if you're not able to make a living like people in my villages did, they left. And Israel is basically counting on the fact that these people, after a certain amount of time where they're dependent on food aid, and these are people with pride who've basically managed to have sustaining livelihoods for so long, probably won't put up with it for that long. 40 years, next year it will be 40 years of Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And that in itself creates a humanitarian crisis and disaster for all of these years. And on top of that now is another humanitarian disaster where Israel is withholding the taxes that it actually owes Palestinians, which I believe is about 60 million a month. These are not donations. This is not international aid. It's actually taxes it collects on behalf of the Palestinians and is obligated to give back. It's withholding that, and on top of that, the international community is withholding its international aid. So now you see these hospitals throughout the West Bank and Gaza, especially Gaza Strip, that don't even have enough medicine for the patients. In 1 month, I believe it was April, 4 patients died because the doctors had to cut back on their dialysis treatment. 160,000 Palestinian employees are now not getting paid. People who work in the health ministry, in the education ministry, and so many of them have still been showing up to work. Because they see the suffering all around them, but even they are now having trouble buying a bus pass to get to work. So in some hospitals, they're diluting medicines now, even chemotherapy medicine, and where the Palestinian Health Ministry is the one that used to pay for transplants, organ transplants, kidney, and so on. The Palestinian Health Ministry used to pay for them because those kinds of treatments are not offered in the occupied territories. So they would have to take them to Israel or to Jordan or to some other country. Now the Palestinian Authority simply cannot afford to do that. These people are pretty much slated to die if this humanitarian disaster continues. And because the PA is actually also forced to make very, very tough decisions right now, which is, should we pay for a group of people who needs priority, like desperate help, which many people in Palestinian society are saying, yes, drop everything and help them. And then they have to decide, well, what about the millions who need electricity and fuel and all of this? It's an unconscionable decision that they're made to face.